Hello, everybody. So, with any good story, the key, the core, is always going to be a moment of decision. And it doesn't matter, the story might not seem to be about a moment of decision. It might feel like it's just a meandering tale, like a stray dog wandering through a railroad town, stopping at this fire hydrant and stopping at that fire hydrant and never getting there. But if it's a good story, it will be about a moment of decision.
When I was growing up in Jersey City, I wasn't a bad kid. I was just a little mischievous. In summer school, one of my buddies wanted to buy a gun. I just happened to know a guy who was selling the gun, Lenny. So I went to Lenny's and I picked up the gun, and the next day I brought it to school. Well, Frankie, before he bought it, he wanted to test fire it. So we took it down to this swampy area down by the Hackensack River, and we set up some cans. Pop, 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 pop. We were shooting at the cans. Next thing I know, I heard some other pops, but they weren't my pops. I looked over and I saw this big bald-headed white guy with this crazy look on his face, and he was shooting at us. And I could hear the bullets whizzing in the weeds past my legs. I wasn't waiting to find out why we were getting shot at. We just took off running, and I don't think we stopped running for about a week. Later, I gave Lenny the $40 that he wanted for the gun, but I charged Frankie $50, and I kept the extra $10 for myself, and we bought beer. And we were sitting around drinking beer, laughing about what happened. And I think that's when me and Lenny decided we were going to become cops.
So if it's a good story, it's always about a moment of decision. Now, in the 1970s, a Lithuanian refugee was working as a farm laborer, and he started to take classes at the University of Toronto, and his name was Endel Tulving, and he developed this theory of episodic memory and became the great researcher and the great leader in understanding how important episodic memory is to us. It is actually the ability to see what we do as a story and to tell what we do as a story that really defines us as human beings. And the evolutionary purpose of this is, we're beginning to understand, is stories are an incredibly good way of transmitting complex clusters of information. So wrap it up in a story and use emotion as stickiness. And this cluster of information can be learned quickly by everybody in the tribe. And all the stories that we tell that distinguish us as human beings from other primates, all of these stories are really about decisions that we make, because what we do as human beings is we make decisions all the time. And that's why we have the long childhood, to learn how to make decisions and to be able to teach our children how to make long decisions, again, through storytelling. And we find in stories that not only is there this key decision, but there's usually a response. So often a story will have a core decision by either the storyteller or someone that the storyteller is dealing with, and then a response decision. So I'm gonna ask you to watch this next video and see if you can see the core decision and the response.
It's my first day of the census, and I'm really excited about going house to house in Brooklyn, knocking on people's doors, asking them, are you black, white, exotic, what's the deal? And as I do, I'm submitting my paperwork, including my identification, my driver's license. When I meet one of my neighbors, Eloise, she turns over and she sees this little dot on my license. She says, oh, honey, what's that about? I say, oh, I'm a donor. In case anything were to happen to me, God forbid, I wouldn't mind giving up a leg, a eyeball, whatever. She smiles and has this glimmer in her eyes, and we become quick friends, going out to different places in the census, including this one house that was really sketchy in Bed-Stuy. She's like, oh, no, 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 honey, that's a crack house. You don't smoke crack, do you, Dawn? And I turn to her, I say, no, Eloise, I don't smoke crack. Why do you ask? She says, Dawn, I need a kidney. Will you be a donor? I said, hell no. I mean, I'm down for the homies, but I'm not about to give a kidney to some woman I just met from the census.
Okay, so I need your help. Who can help me with who makes the decision in this story, the core decision? What's the response decision? Does anybody want to raise a hand and help, or am I just going to have to pick somebody? Come on, raise a hand. You guys are all alphas, right? There we go. There's a real alpha. Expect a business conference like this, everybody's going to be jumping up here.
The core decision was the woman who asked for the kidney.
Right. The core decision is the woman who asks for the kidney, and the response?
Hell no, I think is what she said.
Right, because we saw, the beauty of that story, right, is that it's about a decision, and we're watching, Dawn is telling us about this woman, and we can feel this decision being made. But it wouldn't be a powerful story unless it's about Dawn. Personal stories with our own personal emotions, those are the powerful stories. So anytime that you're trying to transmit information, you need to show your own emotions. These videos come from a new sort of experiment that I've been doing. I'm talking to that. I don't need to. I just talk into the air like magic. I'm not going to get this right. But I have this experiment called Sudden Owl, where what I've been doing is I've been recording people telling 1-minute stories, and sometimes a little bit longer. But what I'm doing with this is I'm trying to really understand, to really break down what it is that makes stories so powerful. So this is a really important experiment, because in a 1-minute story, you see the elements of stories so clearly. And I'm also trying to get it together. Once I'm done with my next book, I'm going to launch this as some kind of a web thing with stories every day and stories from all over the world. But what we've learned all sorts of things about stories through this. One interesting thing is that the decision that's made, there's the core decision, but the response doesn't always come from another person. Sometimes it's simply the response comes from the universe.
So I really didn't want to be there. I'm visiting my mother in her assisted living home. It gets old, it gets hard after a while. I'm driving it from Pittsburgh, it's cold, it's winter, it's snowy. It's a little claustrophobic in her little studio. So I say, let's take a walk. She says, fine. We get in her wheelchair, we cross 11 Mile, we go into what's a cemetery, and it's a little morbid, but I don't care. And my mother says the same thing every time. What a nice park. Why aren't there more people here? I kind of laugh to myself, but I don't say anything. We go back in, we play bingo. She has a card, she doesn't win. We have ice cream, then we have dinner. Then 6:30, time for bed. Put her in her bed, pull up her covers, push her hair back, kiss her. I tell her I love her, and then she says, "This has been the best day of my life. If only Jane were here."
So you might not have understood, or you're probably beginning to understand, that when she says, "If only Jane were here," she's talking about Jane. That was Jane Fishman. So tell me something about the decision in that story and what makes that story powerful. Anybody have any hands to go up? I don't see any. I'm done with you people. Oh!
I think the decision was whether she was going to tell others that her mother had Alzheimer's.
Oh, wow, that's interesting. That's an interesting thought, whether or not she's going to tell anybody else about her mother's Alzheimer's. So the idea is that while she's telling the story, there are decisions that are sometimes being made that are not made explicit in the stories. And that often happens. Who else has a thought about what the decision is? It's all boys, I notice. Alpha boys. Okay, we got you.
The decision is also early in the story of whether she's going to see her mother and participate in this cycle that always ends in the same answer,
Right.
the same result.
Right. That's it. I think, yes, exactly. I think it's about a sort of an ongoing decision that she makes to keep taking care of her mother. And if those of you who have dealt with Alzheimer's know that, you have to gird yourself every day for this horror. And then what's the decision that comes back from the universe? You don't have your hand up now. Here we go.
Well, I think it's that it isn't ever going to change. And so she just has to bone up again. It's like you fool yourself and then you bone up again.
Right. Right. And the universe says, to hell with you. And often the best stories are about how we deal with the universe that is very, very cold and says, to hell with you. It's not really her mother speaking then. It's the universe saying, you're not going to get what you want.
I think it's also saying that it's still worthwhile to visit her mom and take care of her, even though she doesn't know who she is. It's still a worthy act.
Right. Yes, exactly. It's that ongoing decision. It's my decision to stop using this mic and to just speak into the air and to be comfortable with that, just comfortable with talking. So I want to tell you a little about the Moth. I started the Moth in 1997, figuring that, I was in New York. I'd had a couple of successful novels. I was, I felt very good about my life, but I missed my childhood in Georgia, and I missed all the stories. So in my loft, I brought a bunch of people, and we had a big night of storytelling. And it was awful. It was a total disaster. Everybody went on for like 25 minutes, and that was the first rule of the Moth. I learned to invent the little idea of a little violin to cut people off. And people always thought that they had to have some kind of moral to their story. But all we wanted to see was vulnerability. We just wanted to see human beings telling about their day-to-day struggle with existence. And so before, somehow I was talked into trying it again, but before I did, I met this guy, Jonathan Ames, who since has become famous because, he had a TV show on HBO called Bored to Death, which was actually inspired by some of his Moth stories. But Jonathan Ames was willing to go up and tell an audience about the first time he masturbated, when he felt it was necessary for him to show the evidence of his successful masturbation to his mother. Now, everybody has stories that are that embarrassing, but most of us think, well, if we tell that story, we'll look bad, or people will disdain us, or they won't respect us. But it was instantly clear when first of all, Jonathan Ames has lines of groupies. He's kind of a small, wiry guy who the women are in love with him because of this incredibly powerful honesty. And as soon as we started to understand that vulnerability and honesty and an ability to reveal our human side is the key, then the Moth became fabulously successful. And now, we're on 400 radio stations, the Moth Radio Hour. Our podcast is the third most popular podcast in the world. We have about 2 million downloads of every story. we do regular moths in 16 cities in the United States and now 4 cities. We've just started in Melbourne and London and Dublin and Edinburgh. And then there are moth clones. In almost every major city of the world, we have groups that were inspired by this idea of personal, vulnerable storytelling. And I just got a video sent to me by people in the Antarctic Research Station who had sort of a moth there. So the moth is this booming idea, which is so exciting because it's really based on human contact. It's really, you've got to go into this space and be with people and listen to their stories and tell stories. And there's this powerful sense of vulnerability, and the moth storytellers just keep getting better and better because they become more and more honest as they realize nothing's going to happen to them except they're going to be more loved.
When I was a kid, I hated this kid named Teddy because you couldn't do anything creative or illegal without him snitching. So I decided that he needed a scare. I had recently come into possession of a jacket he always wore, and with that and a pair of dungarees and some crumpled up newspapers, I fashioned a full-size Teddy dummy, and I tied a clothesline noose around the neck and hoisted it up over a lamppost right in front of his third-floor window. And I started screaming, "Teddy, you are dead!" And the window opened, and out pops the head of Regina, his 4-year-old sister. And she sees her brother twisting in the wind right in front of her. For a second, I'm not sure if this is like bad or like way better, until she screams, "Teddy!" And then I know, bad. And I let go of the rope, like not my rope. And she gets to watch her big brother plummet 25 feet to the sidewalk.
Okay, what's the moment, a moment of decision? Hands. Come on, alphas. Come on, this is a powerful group of important leading American. There, wait. I see one.
To let go of the rope.
To let go of the rope. And what's the... Wait, but okay, so that's a decision, right? Then that is a really important decision, to let go of the rope. But that's interesting, because that's kind of a response to a response. You're nodding, Laura.
I was just agreeing with you.
Yes, and what were you going to say? So what's the original decision?
To shock the sister.
Right, to shock the sister. What's the response? What's the answer?
Too much shock.
Too much. Yeah, the sister gives the response.
Right, and so he drops it because he's then shocked about her shockedness.
Right.
So it's a shocked thing.
Right. Right. Oh, I so much want to talk into this mic. I can't do it. Yes. So it's back and forth, and back and forth, and this vulnerability. The idea of telling vulnerable stories is such an American tradition. It's why Abraham Lincoln got elected, because he was a loser. He didn't try to project himself as a winner. Seward was the winner, and Lincoln gets the nomination because everyone can relate to Abraham Lincoln, because he tells stories of being a loser. Granted, a powerful loser and a wise loser, and one who's able to have moments of decision, but he's still a loser. And when Mark Twain went around the country telling stories of his complete laziness when he was a soldier, and his cowardice, and the fact that he deserted, audiences were appalled, but they were also mesmerized. And that honesty is what made Mark Twain the head of the American pantheon of raconteurs, because what we really want to listen to, the stories that we really want to hear, are the stories told by people who know that they constantly screw up and that they're total frauds. A few months ago, I gave this year's Moth Award to Louis C.K. And when I did, I pointed out that, Louis C.K. tells us quite openly about his volcanic anger at people who are actually quite nice. And the fact that his own kids bore him to death. And that every day he goes on leaves him with an abyss of despair. And these are things that we think about and that happen to us, but we don't tell them. But when he tells them, we feel that we are exactly him. And that's what makes him so powerful. He has that great timing and his tenderness. But what really makes it work is that he knows that he's the greatest fuck-up that ever lived. And he's not unwilling to let you know. And that makes him, I think, maybe the most powerful writer of our day. Now, celebrities in general can seem so much more powerful if they are willing to present themselves as very vulnerable. So I'm going to show you a clip from Neil Gaiman, who is a friend of mine and a very famous writer who always has thousands of kids hanging around. He writes, he mostly writes for young people. So if you haven't heard of him, don't feel bad. Your children will know him. And yet when he tells a story, he knows that he needs to tell a vulnerable story. He's telling a story here about a woman named Amanda Palmer, a rock and roll star that he met.
I'd been on a date, and it was the best date of my life. And when it ended, she said that she didn't want me to call her. She'd call me in a few weeks or when she was ready, because she wanted to think. And I knew what that meant. Don't call me, I'll call you. And I went home to the Midwest, and it was minus 24 degrees. So I put my old dog, my old rescue dog, into the back of my Mini, and I drove to Florida. I drove for 2 days. And in Florida, at my friend's house, I finally got to sit and think, and I thought, I was happy for 3 days. And for 20 years, I've been miserable. And if I never get anything more than that, I got 3 days of happiness. And that's enough. And I looked at my dog, and my dog looked at me. And then the phone rang.
Okay, hands should just go up. Just to say anything you want about this story. Actually, one thing I'm interested in, does it work for you? Do you feel that he's vulnerable? Yes, yes, yes. Okay, back here.
I think what's so beautiful about that is that he was willing to move on and be happy for those couple of days, and then what a nice surprise when she called.
Yeah.
And that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Yeah. What else?
I was just going to ask if it was her, because I got so drawn into the story that I'm like, okay, well, what happened next? Did she call, or was it someone else, and was it just that he was open to being happy and the opportunity presented itself?
No, weirdly, it turned out that it was Comcast. But he was okay with that because he's been so waiting for Comcast to get back to him. No, not only was it her, but they will have their first child any day. Or I think I would be on tour with them, but they got, Amanda Palmer got pregnant. So these stories of vulnerability and the ability to express oneself as vulnerable and yet still able to make decisions. So important. And I'm going to play for you now. There was a man named David Garth who was a great political genius. And back in the 1960s, John Lindsay was running for re-election as mayor. And David Garth realized everybody hated Lindsay. His poll numbers were in the pits. It had been one disaster after another. And David Garth said, well, Lindsay is good enough that we can make this into something powerful by exposing his vulnerability.
I guessed wrong on the weather before the city's biggest snowfall last winter, and that was a mistake. But I put 6,000 more cops on the streets, and that was no mistake. The school strike went on too long, and we all made some mistakes. But I brought 225,000 new jobs to this town, and that was no mistake. And I fought for 3 years to put a 4th police platoon on the streets, and that was no mistake. And I reduced the deadliest gas in the air by 50%, and I forced the landlords to roll back unfair rents. And we did not have a Detroit, a Watts, or a Newark in this city. And those were no mistakes. The things that go wrong are what make this the second toughest job in America. But the things that go right are what make me want it.
Okay, so that commercial was about exposing vulnerability and winning over an audience by being willing to admit, I'm a human being, I make mistakes like everybody. But it also was about something else. It's about a moment of decision. And who has an idea about what the decision of that commercial is? Go ahead. Scott.
His decision was to own the moment and to own his mistakes and to be forthcoming with it. It happened before the story was told.
Right. That's true. There's another decision that's being made. And Lindsay is asking you to be complicit in this decision. Anybody have any thoughts?
No, but I'm from Comcast. I just want to take the microphone away from you.
Oh my God. If I'd known Comcast was in the room, can you help me?
Absolutely.
I can't get anybody to show up.
Absolutely.
Oh my God. I'm so happy.
It's as if there is a decision to ask for forgiveness and a second chance.
And a second chance. The decision that he's making, and it's as though he's making the decision while the commercial's going on, is he's saying, he's making the decision, well, this is so awful. It's so awful to be hated as much as I'm hated. But I want a second chance. I want to try this again. What do you think? He's quietly asking the audience, will you support me? I need your help. And that decision, that's at the end he says, it's the problems in the city that make this the toughest, that make this the second toughest job in America. But, it's solving them that makes me want it. Makes me want it. My decision is I'm running again. And it's a really, really tough decision. I'm going to show you a piece now, and I want you to really think about the decisions being made in this story.
When I was 16 years old, I was cutting grass on a hot summer day in Savannah, and the lady of the house came running out of the house just screaming, help, 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 and she had her hands up in the air. I ran in the house and I looked, and her husband had keeled over, heart attack. I looked at her and I said, you, go call 911, and pointed to the phone, and she walked that way. I ran out, jumped in my 1962 Chevy wagon, 3-speed on the column, squealed out of the driveway, ran over to Dr. Baker's house, pulled right up front. There he was in the garden, down on his knees in the dirt, and I said, Dr. Baker, heart attack, heart attack, heart attack, and he jumped up and jumped in the car. We squealed right back to the Porter's house. He jumped out of the car, ran into the room, jumped on Mr. Porter. The ambulance came. Mr. Porter died. The next day I called Dr. Baker and I said, "When did you know?" And he said, "I knew the minute I walked in, but you gotta try."
So what's the decision that he's talking about? Over here, you guys have you've been so out alpha. You're like, this is the beta side of the room.
The decision to perform CPR even though he knew he was already dead.
Right. That's probably the core decision, and what Tom learns from that. And then there's also the decision. Tom's making a decision, yes? What do you say?
The decision to get the other doctor,
Right.
even though the ambulance was coming.
Right, and also the fact that he's pretty energized here. But I find this story is not completely successful because it's beautiful that we sort of learn about, when Tom says, well, you got to try. That's a beautiful thing that he says. And yet, what often happens in stories is people will think that the most important part of the story is the exciting part. So they'll tell, for instance, how they got stranded, or how they got in an accident, or they'll tell, or how they got fired. They'll tell all sorts of stuff, but what they're telling is not really about a decision. In this case, it's not as though we think that Tom's going to go slowly. We love the little detail that he gives about, the force beat on the column or whatever. And we love the fact that he's rushing and that he's learning something. But what really happens in this story, this is a story about a man who has a heart attack, and he can't prevent it. So to me, when I hear these stories told at the Moth, and people are always presenting these stories, and some of them are, they're hilarious. A home invasion story, or told by the woman who writes Dexter, and it should be hilarious, but she has no decisions to make, so it's not quite as powerful. But what is powerful is when we tell, any time, we take our stories and make them into stories of decision. And you'll see everywhere, you'll see how stories contend and how the most powerful stories are the ones that involve decision. Look, for example, at the story of Apple versus Microsoft, which is really the story of Steve Jobs versus Bill Gates. Now, obviously, when we go to buy these products, a really important thing is how well they work and how well they work in our own lives. But there's a motivating thing, which is often that we know the stories behind these products. And the story of Steve Jobs, someone who is fired, and who is, his next company's not doing very well. He's a little bit lost. We don't think of him as a success, even though he still has hundreds of millions of dollars. He's not a real success. But his story is then how he pulls it together and makes this decision and comes back. The Bill Gates story is not nearly as interesting because he's completely successful. They haven't found a way to show Bill Gates as having some fatal flaw that he has to overcome. And Microsoft should be working on that, because one of the reasons people respond to Apple so emotionally is we have an emotional response to that story. We saw that in the election between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney. Barack Obama had struggled, came from, a single mother. He came, he was a black man, so there was that struggle. And he ran against Mitt Romney, who had everything handed to him. So whatever you thought politically about these two, there was a tendency for people to kind of like the Barack Obama story. And there was a moment in the campaign when Barack's advisors they were just pounding Mitt Romney with the Bain Capital story. And you know, that he was sending jobs overseas. And whatever you think about Romney's rightness or wrongness in running Bain Capital, when he responded, he didn't come back and say, hey, I screwed up, I'm a human being. I failed. I'm a bit of a failure. I'm not perfect. No, he came back and said everything was perfect. Everything I did for Bain Capital was exactly the right thing. And that's why he failed a little bit, I think. And this is a thing that I think you all can use. You know, every project that you work on has an origin story. And at some point, you'll be talking to a client, or you'll be presenting, you know, you'll be presenting to the world. And the origin story, I think, is one that you really have to think of, because there's almost always a moment in the origin story where the project looks like it's going to die. That always happens. So now, you know, it might die. I don't know. You know, it's a little bit hard to do that and write novels. And there's a lot more that's screwed up with it, but I'm not going to talk about now. But, and the Moth came to a moment where we were, we just have to close the Moth. We don't, you know, we can't do these stories. But the story can be told, and it needs to be told in a very emotional, personal way. You need to be able to tell, this is a story about me, even if it's a very technical story. Somehow there's a decision that you make that is simply an emotional decision. You know that your job's on the line. And so that's how we can use stories to really win people over. Now I'm going to show these last two stories I just want you to just sort of revel in them. There are decisions being made. It's a mother and a daughter talking about the same man at a 50-year distance. And we start with the mother. Oh, it's me.
When I was young, I signed on as a deckhand on a big, beautiful schooner that sailed the Caribbean. Once, we came into dock in Miami for repairs, and I found myself to be the only one who was really staying on the ship. I used to feed the sea cows scraps, and one day, early one morning, I looked out and saw bubbles rising up out of the sea. I ran to get the scraps. I ran back. I threw them on the ocean, and much to my shock and delight, a beautiful young man came up out of the midst of them. It turned out that he was a skin diver who had been hired to scrape the barnacles off the bottom of the boat. As he boarded the boat, he had some trouble with his wetsuit, and he asked me if I would help him with the zipper of his wetsuit. That night, I wrote my mother and dad and said, I have just met the man that I'm going to marry. 51 years with that beloved boy who came to me out of the depths of the sea.
Okay, so what is the decision that she makes, and what's the response? Betas. There we go. Where are you? Here, go ahead. Wait.
She decided to feed the sea cow. Which
that's the decision she makes.
Yeah.
Just to feed the sea cows.
Right.
And the response? The
response is she found her husband.
Right. She finds love and bliss and, whoops, sorry. The most amazing romance, I can tell you because I know these people very well. Now we'll watch her daughter tell about the same man.
The ocean was always a symbol of my parents' love for one another, So when my father died after 50 years of marriage, we decided on a burial at sea. When we set sail that day, my mother told us that if we were to see a dolphin, it would be a symbol, a sign that my father was with us and we could spread his ashes. We saw no dolphin, but we spread his ashes anyway. As we sailed back to the marina, my mother suddenly cried out. I thought it was despair. Then she cried out again, and I looked to see a dolphin keeping pace with us. Then my sister cried out, more dolphins. And when I looked again, there were 3 dolphins. When I looked again, there were 5. Then there were 10. Then there were 100. Then there were 1,000. When all was said and done that day, there were 2,000 dolphins, maybe more, who kept pace with us. It was the rarest of occurrences. They call it a superpod. Dolphins as far as the eye could see.
So, what's the decision and what's the response from the universe?
I think burying in sea and spreading the ashes was the decision, and I think both the mother's story and the daughter's story, there's this just unimaginable response from the universe, which makes it so powerful and moving. So that was very strong.
Yeah, I agree. It's the universe responds with thousands of dolphins. There were, in fact, according to the news reports that day, upwards of 20,000 dolphins. But I asked Chloe not to say that because I thought, okay, this gets ridiculous. 2,000 is enough. Who can think of a detail or something in those 2 stories that you really like? Something you really, or you hated? That's also permissible. Here, hold that.
Actually, sorry, I was going to say that I thought it was interesting that the dolphins was such a powerful moment for her. So I thought she also made a decision that dolphins were going to be the symbol of him being there.
Right, exactly. And so that's fascinating. It's a decision that was made, that decision was made 50 years before when the mother's feeding the sea cows. And they've sort of decided. Of course, they were always living on the ocean. By the way, really interesting, the man that they're talking about is Zalman King, who was a famous producer of and writer. He wrote, you know that movie 9.5 Weeks? Sort of porny. He also did Red Shoe Diaries. And actually, this is really interesting. The whole family worked on these porn films. Chloe would write them. When she was 21 years old, she'd be writing these little porn things, and then the mother would be producing, and then he would direct. And they had the sweetest relationship. There was no, they were so apple pie and ordinary, and it's so bizarre that they were writing that anyway. Odd little thing there. So I think I have 1 minute. So if somebody had a question that's burning, I could answer a question about anything that you want to ask about what I had for breakfast, or yes, very good. Go back to you. What's your name, by the way?
Rish. I think all of, in our jobs, what we do, the quest is always about, finding that story behind the brand or, whatever assignment we are working on. Are there any insights on how to discover those stories behind these things? And a lot of times it's really hard. They're not very obvious. So any insights around that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I've been starting to do some work with corporations, and so I will, I can only say in the 30 seconds I have left, I can say that I always look for a personal moment of decision. And there always is. Brands are never begun without somebody having to make a decision, and the response from the universe is almost always very cold, in the beginning. And that's what makes it so interesting. And then comes some moment which is sort of the key to why we know that this is going to work. You know, it's Orville Redenbacher can be, you know, we were doing that in Chicago. They were talking about those moments of decision where people are, it wasn't Redenbacher though, I'm sorry, it was the other popcorn company. What were they called? Yeah, Garrett. And they were, but just talking about how a family makes that decision. And the reason that that's so important is that that's when the decision is really small. And that's when it's so moving. You know, it's before it's become a big corporation, before there are, you know, all of these stockholders that have to be responded to, and, you know, percentages and quarterly reports. There's this initial moment which often takes place, you know, in a restaurant over a cocktail napkin. And it's really important, I think, for everybody to be thinking about that decision a lot, because that decision should keep informing the company. You know, it's why Apple spends a lot of time thinking about, well, who really are we? What was the essence of Steve Jobs? And what is the essence of how we make these decisions? So I am done now, and I thank you all very, very much.